Hi, this is Scott Allen, and this module is going to cover fonts and text in CSS. It's inside of this module where you will find out how to specify the fonts that you want to use for the textual content of your site, like a monospace font or a font with a serifed typeface, and also how to set the font properties to make that text italicized or bold. In addition, we'll also be looking at text properties, including the ability to indent and align text, and we'll be styling a page of textual content as a demonstration. In CSS, you can select the font you want to use for the text inside of a particular element by setting the font-family property in a style rule. But before we get into the details of font family, we'll have to understand how to use font names. Because when we create a web page, we don't always know what our users will use to view that web page. It might be a PC, a smartphone, even a refrigerator. And we cannot be sure that all of the devices that users will have the same set of fonts available, because specific fonts are not defined by web standards, and the web browser is going to rely on the user's system, like Windows or OS X, to provide them with the fonts that we request. What the CSS standards do define is a collection of 5 font categories. The first of these categories is the categories of serifed fonts. An example of a specific font that would fit in this category would be Times or Times New Roman, as well as Baskerville, Century, and Schoolbook. Those are specific font names, like Baskerville, Century, and Schoolbook. Those are the font names that you might see in a drop-down list when you're selecting a font inside of a word processor, because the word processor knows exactly what is installed on your machine. But to CSS, all these fonts would fall under the category of serifed fonts. There is also a set of sans serif fonts, or sans serif, depending on what part of the world you come from, and a popular font that falls into this category is Arial. In case you didn't know, serifs are the small lines at the end of a letter. They make the letters look a little bit fancy and embellished. You can see the difference in the R letters that are on the screen now. The R on the left is an Arial, which is sans serif, literally without the embellishments, while the R on the right is Times New Roman, and it contains a few extra little strokes here and there. Generally speaking, people find the sans serif fonts easier to read on an LCD display. There are also categories for cursive fonts, which look a bit like handwritten letters, and fantasy fonts, which can look like anything, but most designs are not going to make heavy use of these fonts because they can be hard to read and also a little bit unpredictable. We're not exactly sure how they're going to display on the end user system. Finally, there is a category for monospace fonts. These are the fonts that give equal spacing to every letter, and that's probably the font that you want to use in your text editor that you use to create CSS, and also the font that you would want to use on a web page to display code in a web page. Let's take a look at these fonts in a browser. Here inside of Visual Studio, I have all of the markup that is required to display that page that is on the right-hand side of the screen. And currently, there are no styles defined except for 2 different background colors. And what I'd like to do throughout the rest of this module is use some of the things that we're learning about fonts to improve the display of this page. Right now, it feels like the header is a little bit too large. It feels like the code that is in the middle of that page is hard to read because it's not formatted the way I expect. Those are the types of changes we're going to be making. But before we do that, I want you to take a close look at that web page and tell me what category of font is being used. I think it's a serif font. It's the default font actually that both Chrome and Internet Explorer would use to display this web page unless I style it differently. And remember that I said that generally speaking, a sans serif font is going to be easier to read, so that's one of the first changes we're going to make. However, that is a subject for debate. What you could do is go around to some of your favorite sites and see what type of font they're using and come to a decision about what you think is the cleanest. I think what's interesting is that if you look at sites like Twitter, they're obviously using a sans serif font. If you look at a site like Google, the search results and the text on the side, that's all sans serif. But when you go to a website that behind it is a company that is used to print media, for instance, Smithsonian.com. Smithsonian.com is the website for the Smithsonian Magazine. They are using a font that would fall in the serif category. Also, The Washington Post, which is a newspaper, they're using a font that would match what they use in print. Serif fonts are very popular in print. I do think this might be something particular to news articles. What's interesting is if you go to a site like Yahoo, then a lot of the text that you see throughout their site is a sans serif font. But when you drill down into a news article on the Yahoo site, suddenly they changed over into a serif font. Let's take a look at what happens on our page if we change the font here. So I'm going to go in and say that the font family, and I'll pick sans serif, and you can see the different feel that gives to the web page. Let's also try monospace. The code looks better, but everything else looks worse. Let's also try fantasy. That's very difficult to read. And let's try cursive. And I think, given those options, let's go back to this setting for right now. Many CSS designs will set the font family property to the name of a specific font, like Arial. However, there's always a chance that the specific font you want, like Arial, that it's not available on a given user system. And that's one of the reasons you can specify as many fonts as you like in a comma-delimited list, and the browser will use the first one that matches. In this sample on the screen, we have a first choice, a second choice, and if neither of those fonts are available, we are falling back to the generic sans serif, because even if the browser doesn't have any of the other fonts, it must provide a default font for that category. Of course, this raises the question of what fonts are safe to use for web design. Generally speaking, you can't go wrong with Arial, Verdana, Times, and Courier, but I've also provided a list here of other fonts that are commonly available on multiple platforms. Helvetica is a common font that you'll see listed in many style sheets, but Helvetica is not available on Windows. Windows provides Arial instead. Let's take a look at the font settings on these websites that we visited earlier. I'll start with Twitter. Inside of Chrome, what I can do is select an area like this and right-click and say Inspect Element. That'll bring up the developer tools that we looked at earlier in this course, and that will tell me what font family is in effect. It's down here at the bottom for Twitter. The font is Lucidia Grande or sans serif, depending on what is available. And we'll talk about what the 0.75 EM is in just a bit. Let's also look at Google. Its search results are displaying with a font family of Arial, or basically then any sans serif font that's available. Let's take a look at the Smithsonian Magazine. Its font is Georgia, or Times New Roman, or any serif font. You can see that Times New Roman, when you have spaces in the font family name, you can enclose that in quotes. And finally, let's look at the Yahoo News. We'll inspect this element. And we can see here the font family is Georgia, or Times New Roman, or then just a font from the serif category. Something else that you might have picked up on is that we talked about inherited properties earlier in this course, and font family is one of those properties that is inherited. So if I set it at the body level, then the paragraphs and the divs and the anchors that are inside of that body will pick up that font family by default unless I override it. So for instance, this header here, this H1 tag, it is inheriting the font family from the body, but it doesn't have to be that way. I could say that for the H1, the font family should be Times New Roman, serif, and refresh the page, and you can see that it has a different style than the rest of the web page. And what does happen when you specify a font that doesn't exist? And let me make sure that I put Times New Roman inside of a quote here. I will ask for a font that doesn't exist. You can see that's not going to produce an error on the page. The browser is simply going to move on to the next font and try to pick it up.